What do you think of the National Security Council?
I think the idea of having such a council is a good one for two reasons. The first, we haven't got enough money, and secondly, you can no longer understand security on a home and away basis. And for about 100 years, we've organised ourselves on the basis that we can treat defence and security in parallel as separate activities, and been able to understand security on the basis of home and away. So you had departments, the Foreign Office, the Home Office, the Admiralty and War Office, now the Ministry of Defence, accordingly, and we carved out the money and so forth to do it that way. As I say, the situation's changed. We haven't got enough money to do it that way. And secondly, you can't treat security on a home and away basis, largely because of the speed, reach and range of global communications. And we, of all nations, sit in the centre of the inhabited world, if you see it in a globe, and are utterly dependent in peace and war on our ability to trade, because we can't feed ourselves and we can't heat ourselves in peace or war unless we trade. We can't stand a siege. So it is in our absolute interest to ensure our security on that continuum and not on the basis of home and away, as we've used to be able to do. But there are consequences of this idea, which is that we are now understanding defence and security on a linear basis. We're somewhere on a line between those two activities, and therefore this council, or whomsoever, has to be able to decide where we are on that line. You can't allow events to just tell you. You've got to decide it and anticipate it. And because you've got to be able to reportion priorities, resource, and maybe demand more resource because of the imperative of the moment. And I don't see those necessary consequences of the decision, which I think is the right one, appearing yet.
Right. How would you improve the National Security Council?
So that it could do the following things. To decide on a greater frequency than once every 2 years where we are on that line between defence and security. To be able to have the authority and responsibility for reassigning the priorities as a consequence of that recognition of where we are, and the allocation of resource accordingly. It has also got to be able to state the objective at that time, rather than the more general ones that appear, as no doubt you will ask me shortly, in the national security strategy. The objective has to be rather more concretely stated in the event. Because one of the consequences of our modern circumstances is that we don't know what the threat is. The whole of the construct of the previous 100 years is that we've had a threat. We've been able to say that this is the threat. We don't know what it is anymore. And so it's even more important that in our analysis of where we are between security and defence, we have to identify what the threat is and what is threatened. And it must be able to do that. It's sufficient to allocate resource and priorities accordingly.
Thank you very much. Julian Brazier.
Sort of that leads us directly on then to let's put the question really widely. What did you think about SDSR in general terms?
In general terms, I thought it was an incoherent nonsense.
And more specifically, would you like to give us some for instances within that? I mean,
I don't see it. It was, to me, a mismatch of decisions. We'd need to have the bit of paper in front of me to be able to spell it out, but they didn't match anything that I'd read or properly understood, or if I had properly understood, in the national security strategy. I don't see how the two match, and within the, if you just took the decisions of the SDSR as a whole, they were incoherent within themselves.
We've had some testimony from other witnesses on this, but it would be very helpful to know where you see the biggest gaps. I mean, you mentioned, as I see it, you're raising 2 points. Firstly, that we're not addressing the security side. You've already made that point, the wider national security policy. Without a clear identification of the threat, which is difficult, it's difficult to match it up. But you've also suggested there's an internal issue about the way in which the bits of SDSR hang together. Would you like to expand on that second point?
Yes. Perhaps it would help, at least for my answers, to say what I think security and defence mean, because we tend to use them as words as synonyms, and I don't think they are. Security, in my view, is the prevention of a latent threat becoming patent. And do it in such a way that should you fail in your prevention of the latent becoming patent, you fail at sufficient distance in time and space that you can now do something about it. This is why your barbed wire fence is that far away. You force the man to cut it, to come through it, identify himself, and time for you to put the lights on, and your reaction force to deal with him. That's security. It's a subjective series of judgments about risk and reward or gain, and you decide this. But the moment it has failed and the threat has appeared, you want to have been able to identify it for what it is, but now you have to defeat it or deter it. And it's now absolute. It's an objective set of decisions of loss or threatened loss of gain, or it's binary. And if we're going to treat security and defence as being along a line, then in each case you have to understand where you are. This is what I mean about being, because at some point you've actually are going to go back into defence. And there's a time in achieving this. And it is that is, and I call this in my own mind, elasticity. If we do what we are doing, then we must have some elasticity in our defensive arrangements to be able to expand again, to handle that particular problem when we've identified it. And we have to build the security arrangements, which may well involve the armed forces. It's not only, it's all our capability doing this. But they've got, their whole purpose is to identify the threat in time. And that's what I don't see in any of this construct.
Right. It would still be helpful if you could follow one particular strand through. If you could take us through a particular threat scenario and show us where you think that incoherence actually falls, where somewhere between security and defence the ball would fall.
This is as long as a piece of string. We'll just imagine something happening. The question that I ask is, have we the built-in elasticity to be able to expand, to react, which may not be expansion, it may be reallocation of resource to something happening. Now, I'm about to imagine something that what's going on at the moment in the Middle East leads to an outbreak of intercommunal strife in Cyprus, such that it threatens the sovereign base areas and our interest in those areas, and so forth. Can we react to that today? Have we got the capacity to do what we did in 1974 when the Turks invaded then and all those refugees arrived, quite apart from whether our sovereign bases are actually attacked? Could we expand to do that? Since we have these are part of our territories, they are, this is part of the kingdom as opposed to something we can ignore. This is where we have interests that are to do with our own outer ring of security, if you like. Could we go and guard those places, defeat anyone who tried to attack them, take them over, and so forth? I doubt it.
Could we in 1974?
We did.
Could we if we'd had a real threat that was coherent in 1974? Proper attack?
Yes, I think we could have done. We went and did it a bit later in the Falklands, and that was an even bigger affair. It's a very long time ago, but we certainly sent a whole brigade headquarters and at least 2 other battalions there, and so on and so forth at the time.
So Decatur and Africa.
We've asked you what you think of the SDSR. We've asked you what you think of the National Security Council. Haven't asked you what you think of the National Security Strategy.
The bit in the middle, if you like. I think it's rather more policy, declaratory, than a strategy saying how you're going to do something, where your priorities lie, and so forth. It states the objectives, you might say 2.5 objectives, if I remember correctly. There's we're to secure and protect the kingdom. It's not quite clear whether that's the people or the place. And we're to have a safe, secure context in which we live. Those are very general objectives. And then it says that we are to have no diminution, I think it is, of our influence abroad. That I find difficult in the circumstance to understand and how to achieve that in the circumstances.
I think we share your view.
Nevertheless, it states some broad ends. It's much less about how you achieve it, with what we achieve it. I don't think it gives a very clear statement, as I have done already, about our absolute dependence on the ability to trade and therefore to communicate. Whether it's with container traffic or megabytes of information, it amounts to the same thing. I don't think it makes enough of our inability to act alone and our need to act in concert with others and in what circumstances. It says a lot about wanting a rules-based world and so on and so forth. Well, we don't talk about our paucity of resource, which means that it's very difficult for us to act alone, if at all. And if that's the case, and our objective is a rules-based world, then I would like to see a bit more about just where we're going than, if I recall correctly, a paragraph that says we will work closely with allies, notably NATO, the US, etc.
So we have the strategy, the review, defence and security apparently, that's what it's called, review. You say is not terribly coherent. But we have the NSC. I mean, in a sense, you're saying that because you can't play home and away, it's all one thing. I mean, you described cabinet government, didn't you, when you described the NSC? Because all of the various departments should be coming together to address this. So, what's the NSC? Is it a war cabinet? What is the role? Where is the agent? Is it the NSC, or is it that actually says, yes, we need to expand or whatever, this is our elasticity, we need to make a decision, all the decision makers are in the room, let's make a decision. Now, is that being done in the NSC, and the Treasury are committing money in the NSC? Where does this leave cabinet government?
Here you must correct me if I've misunderstood something, but my understanding, it is in effect a cabinet committee. Its non-cabinet members aren't members. I think they're called advisors if you look at the piece of paper. And therefore, that is exactly what it is. But that isn't what we've said we're doing. What we say we're doing is having a cross-department homogeneous whole. Comprehensive. You must be able to do those things I list, which is it requires some authoritative body that can alter resource and so forth. At the moment, we seem to have fallen between enlarging a cabinet committee more or less and not addressing the institutional structures, departments, budgets, etc., beneath that cabinet. And until we do, I don't see how you can arrive at the answer, if you like, to the conundrum you posed to me.
Please, let's do it.
In the previous evidence session, we asked the three chiefs of the services as to whether, looking at their current capability and looking ahead to 2015, they would still describe our capabilities, full spectrum capability. And all three said no. Presumably you'd agree with that.
I'm sorry.
They all said no.
But
we were no longer full spectrum.
Do we have a full spectrum
capability?
No, I don't think we do.
When would you say we last had full spectrum capability?
Your spectrum is utterly dependent upon your opponent or the threat. So you never know what you've got until you have an enemy. I just want to make a point about capability. This isn't an inventory. A capability isn't a list of things I have. A capability is measured against your opponent on the day, and he is going to make it difficult for you.
But given that you were quite happy to say no, there must be a moment when you can say yes. So when would you last have said yes?
I would have thought it could be said that we probably last proved we had a full capability to operate in the Falklands.
That's a pretty long time ago.
And I say that as the commander of the division in the Gulf in 1991.
So what would now be the greatest, if you... Sorry.
Because we couldn't have done that on our own.
So you didn't think that we had full spectrum capability in 1991?
No, we were dependent in some measure or other on our ally.
We had to be, or we chose to be?
I think we had to be. We could not have done that on our own.
And what's the likelihood of us ever becoming again a full spectrum capability?
Unless we're frightened enough and open and alter the basis on which we're conducting this debate and time, there isn't a prospect. You've got to change what we're doing. What we've designed in such as is a design in the SDSR, I speak for the Army now, in a full-blown fight, we have said we will be capable of fielding a brigade for overtime, if I remember that correctly. Well, that covers you in terms of defence of a piece of territory of about the distance between Aldershot and Fleet, which from my memory is about 5 to 6 kilometres. Now,
Right.
I dare say the Navy and the Air Force could produce me a sort of round figure like that.
So by default, it's a list of dependencies that we've described there.
We cannot operate alone. We don't want to operate alone, do we?
We've identified the dependencies.
We're saying that we want a rules-based society. That must mean that you operate with others.
Please listen.
I mean, it was in a sense, you've answered. I was about to ask you about. Chief of Defence Staff said to us that the national security strategy is not a bad objective in terms of our ends, but I would say that the ways and means are an area of weakness. I think from what you said early on, you think that only begins to describe the weaknesses of the document, or how would you comment?
I would say we're more or less saying, I think, much the same thing. It's a general statement of policy. It doesn't tell me how we're going to strike the balance between the security of, say, move slightly away from just the military. In the document in question, there's this talk about the problems when the fuel depot in north of London burst in flames. I can't remember the name of the place. Nobody draws a deduction if it caused a complete disruption of the avgas supply for 2 years, that perhaps we shouldn't be dependent on only one. Why isn't there a principle in there that says we should have 2 of everything, that we're dispersed, that we don't cluster it all around London or wherever? That seems to me to be the sort of thing that we ought to be putting in our national security strategy, that we have dispersion, that we're capable of expanding our organisations back into a defensive role. That is strategic in my understanding.
And whilst there's much talk of the focus on resilience, clearly you don't think it's there in practice.
Well, if we can barely supply our civil aviation with fuel for 2 years, then we got away with it, perhaps. But that's hardly resilience when it was an accident. What happens if some cove actually works out that one of these threats, I might be a terrorist, but wouldn't it be fun to blow up all their oil?
I'm not sure whether I have to call you Sir still, but General will do, I suppose, now. Nice to see you again.
It'll do.
All right, General. I think Sir will do too. When you said full spectrum, you defined full spectrum capability in a rather straightforward way between Aldershot and Fleet or something. Based on that criteria, the United States hasn't got full spectrum capability either, because you might say that actually you'd extend that line to Glasgow. They could defend that sort of area. So under those narrow definitions of full spectrum capability that you used, the United States wouldn't have full spectrum capability. Or have I misunderstood?
Oh, I think I don't.
You changed the ground.
My description was merely to say what we could do on a more or less full spectrum basis.
Yeah.
Now, before you go much further, how many potential opponents are going to outmatch 5 kilometres as opposed to from here to Glasgow? I'm not talking. I was merely using that as an example of actually what we've costed and said that by whatever it is, 2020, this is what we're going to be able to sustain. Well, that's not a lot.
Just very quickly, also following your logic through, it does seem strange that the national security strategy says so little about maritime security when we're not only an island, but we've also had the recent example of Mumbai, of a land threat coming from the sea.
I would like to see a great deal more concentration on the absolute essential of trade. it says, we require prosperity. Well, prosperity comes from trade. Well,
and it has to come through the ports.
If that logic is there, then, and you want a holistic approach, then we have to consider how we do this and who our trading partners are, and so on and so forth. And this might be how you start to categorise where you do intervene and where you don't, where you do want to pay attention, because we're certainly not capable of paying attention everywhere. It starts to tell us where our priorities lie.
And paying attention is important because the National Security Strategy talks about conflict prevention being one of the key objectives, and if you haven't got full spectrum capability, then preventing conflicts becomes very important. What's your view of our capacity to engage in that role, for our armed forces to engage in that role at the moment, given the operational commitments that we have that leave us fairly stretched?
I have extreme difficulty with the idea that conflict prevention is caused by fighting. If you want, my experience is that if you want to intervene in someone else's fight, then you've got to win it. And you might find yourself fighting all of them. Now, just be quite clear what you're taking on before you start to talk about conflict prevention as an act of your armed forces. Because you've got to beat the lot, or potentially got to beat the lot, which is what America found once it was in Iraq.
But you can use your armed forces before you come to conflict. I mean, conflict prevention is not conflict resolution. They are two different things.
The role of your armed forces in preventing that conflict coming about, again, has got to be very carefully thought through and metered. Are you siding with one side or the other? Are you threatening that if you start a fight, I'll come and stop it? What are you actually trying to? What are you using that force for?
Well, I think
are you saying, no, I'll stand between you, in the classic UN thing? In which case, you've signed a blank cheque on that manpower until the other two parties have sorted themselves out.
Well, it might actually be training the local forces to deal with a perceived threat.
In which case, you've joined a side.
Yeah, but we've done that in many cases.
Indeed, and look where it's got us sometimes.
So you're better staying out, and if it becomes...
I'm not saying one is better or the other. You need to enter this with a rather clear-headed view that the something that must be done isn't necessarily the application of armed force. Because, as others have heard me say, like pregnancy, you can't be a little bit pregnant, you can't be a little bit interventionist, as we're discovering in Libya at the moment.
So are you saying it's really for FCO and DFID to look after conflict?
No, not necessarily. You might well have the military involved, but be quite clear what you're doing in the mix. And preventing other people having a fight is a big handful of an idea in which, by 2020, one brigade of soldiers, and it will always be soldiers to do this, not the Navy, not the Air Force, isn't going to go very far.
What would you say about the United Nations Resolution 1973 then?
Please remind me.
About Libya, the duty to protect.
If I'm walking down the street and I hear rape and so forth in the house, I have a clear duty to go and do something about it. Insofar as that idea is in the resolution, I would agree with it. How you go about doing something about it is another matter altogether.
Okay. Vice Chairman,
What am I? Sorry.
Oh, now I'm sweeping everything
I was sweeping everything up, right? Okay, sorry, I was carried away there. I just interested in what I was saying earlier. I mean, you seem to suggest that we described our dependencies rather than our sovereignty in terms of what we've done so far. What are these greater risks then of having done what we've done the way we've done it? And if you had the opportunity to open up this discussion again, what would be the priority that you would revisit?
When you talk about risks, are you talking about how we've analysed risks?
Well, I mean,
or are we talking about the risks of going on down the track we
sort of say the government has said, you know, the spending is the priority. So it's come out with a policy which certainly up until 2015 is one thing, and then maybe it recovers and so on. Now in that, it's prioritised that over some of the other things, capability and so on. So there are risks that come from that.
Oh yes.
And they recognise them, and that's fair enough. I mean, given that's the case, and you had the opportunity to perhaps have another look at it now, and there will be a revision anyway before the 2015. I mean, what is the most important thing that should be revisited?
I would like to see the general idea of treating security and defence as linear, as ideas on the line, so you know where you are. I would like to see that properly developed, and the capacity to redirect and alter how we do things developed. Much as to do the sort of things I've listed already. Secondly, I would like us to understand, and this is my own word for it, that if we are, because of our circumstances, going down this road, and there's no point breaking the bank to have a super insurance policy and then destroying everything else. So quite clear that we haven't got enough money and we've got to think this thing through differently. But we therefore need to recognise that the structures on which how we thought about these things, where we've been able to identify the threat in advance, we've prepared against it and so forth, are gone, they're finished. And so our thinking shouldn't be to try and have, for example, all the right kit in advance. Our whole understanding of what we're doing is to identify the problem coming at us, the threat coming at us, in time to acquire the kit. So you're actually turning the thought process, along with changing from this parallel activity of defence and security and an identifiable threat, you follow the logic through so that you don't go around spending huge amounts of money. What you do is prepare so that you have what I call kernel defence. Play on words. Kernel as in nut, as in seed. So that you build the critical mass into your structures, which I do not find as a result of the SDSR, so that you have the capacity to expand, to react to the particular, which may not be expansionary, it may be to alter direction into a particular area. That's a big, big change. It's long-on thinking, having the right people in the right place, making decisions early, not waiting till the last minute. There's all sorts of factors that come into that. But that's where I think, in logic, the decisions we've made already are taking us.
So one of the capabilities we're losing, areas in which we're diminishing capability, is in terms of intelligence and surveillance, and being able to see
the capacity to it's all of that, plus our ability to actually operate in such a way that you learn.
Right. So do you think there's too much change going on in the sense that the MOD is being asked, and the sort of organisational restructuring and all this rearrangement is too much too quick? I mean, what do you say about pacing and sequencing of these events?
I've been out of the MOD for so long that I'm not.
But do you think the pace and the sequencing should be different?
I don't see why we can't change. The business of if people can't change in the armed forces, then they're not fit for purpose. The whole of battle war is change.
Thank you. Sorry, just jump in there. You've given us a very clear picture, General Smith, of the what we should have been trying to do, in your view, in SDSR, producing this more flexible structure. If there were one really major change you could make in the outcomes in order to deliver the very clear goals that you've set out for us, what would it be? I mean, what really big thing would have been different in terms of where you would have prioritised?
I'm not only talking about the SDSR. We mustn't just bring this straight down to the armed forces. If we're doing this all together on the same line, then you have to understand the whole. That said, this probably lies across a number of, it doesn't go to neat bits of equipment, whether we have aeroplanes or something like that. It is to do with the capacity to learn, and its intelligence in the broadest sense of the word. Acquisition is not just the secret stuff, it's not just having the right radar, it's the capacity to operate and learn as a whole. And I don't see it there in large measure.
What do you think the implications are for UK security policy and the next SDSR if the Prime Minister's ambition to have a larger defence budget by 2015 is not realised?
If the economy can stand it at the time, then if we stay on our current course, I imagine that we'll find ourselves scrambling to fill in the spaces that have been left by the current set of decisions. I don't see it going to make, unless we build in this capacity of what I've called elasticity, then we will find it extremely difficult to use more money usefully, except to add a bit here and add a bit there. We have to have a structure that's coherent and to a purpose to spend the extra money on to make it that much better.
So you touched on sort of planning and procurement. What other big fundamental things need to be addressed and changed?
Well, I hope, I don't know that they are, but I hope the relationships with defence industries are being addressed. Of course we want value for money, we don't want to pay huge sums of money, etc., etc. But in the end, what is in this and on this island is the strategic base from which we operate, and as I've said, we operate in conjunction with others. Now, unless we've got the basis of something there, and that industry is involved in this construct, then we won't have that elasticity. They can't do it if the production line or the design isn't there. Now, this doesn't doesn't demand a sort of Soviet demand for 1,000 tanks a year just to keep the industry going. That's not my point. But the research and development, the possibility that this is of value in time, the concept demonstrators, that sort of idea, those need to be thought through and banked against the future so that when you do identify your threat, you've got some capacity to deal with it.
Do you see that running also to the standing structures then? Standing structures of the military, for example, a balance between reserve forces and standing forces, and also maybe in the security area as well? Is that something?
Yes. I mean, we have armed forces that are, reduced from something that my grandfather would recognise. In circumstances that my grandfather doesn't recognise.
I'm going to ask you finally.
So I've got no trouble about changing the structures.
I'm going to ask you finally to give us 3 bits of advice that you would give. Let us assume we are writing the next Strategic Defence and Security Review in 2015. What 3 things would you say to us to ensure that we got that review right?
Sort out the top hamper, so you've got the decision-making capacity to recognise a threat for what it is when it appears and in time to deal with it. Alter or be thoroughly aware of the way you are judging a risk, and build structures or a defence structure that is capable of, I call it elasticity because it's not only expansion but also moving into another direction. Those would be my 3.
Thank you.
And the middle one, we haven't discussed much, but we've arrived at a methodology which isn't in itself wrong, I don't think, but it is a recognition of our vulnerabilities. It is not a recognition, and it's our vulnerabilities within the strategic base, as opposed to out there, where we say half our objectives are. And it's a recognition, and in its methodology, it assumes a threat, and it assumes a context. And yet, we don't know what the threats are, and we acknowledge in the in the National Security Strategy that we have to manage the context. So we can't be sure of what that is either. And those 2 sets of assumptions are likely to be ignored, particularly if we're only going to address our risk assessment every 2 years, which I think is very dodgy in a volatile world.
Anything else you'd like to say about this?
I could go on for a long time.
Well, you have been utterly fascinating. I think we could go on listening to you for a very long time, but we ought to allow you to go. Thank you.